Hello, welcome to the second week of Diversity in Teaching. I am encouraged by the very thoughtful conversations happening in introductions and in the rest of our discussions so far. This is going to be an exciting summer. I'm looking forward to more conversations this week. Hopefully, everybody has their textbook because we are going to be beginning our reading this week. I expect you to read chapters 1 through 4 this week. This PowerPoint will be looking at some of the content in chapter 1 and 2 and extending on that. We'll be looking at environments a little bit this week, and I'll include things about brave conversations and environments in next week's as well. The quote to start this week: "Identity is never static. It's always something in the making and never made." I think this is really important to remember, that our identity shifts over a lifetime constantly. So we can't assume we know who somebody is based on a few labels and categorizations, and that includes her children as well. So I want to start by sharing a resource with you, and it's the ECE CompSat. It's a tool for looking at competencies for teachers. So what is a competency? It's the ability to do something successfully or efficiently. So we're going to look at what competencies are for teachers and how they're related to diversity in education. There are multiple competencies, and there's trainings connected to them that include ongoing professional development, both online as well as connected to all of the state publications in California. So the competencies are around these different categories: professionalism, administration, supervision, child development and learning, culture, diversity and equity, relationships, interactions and guidance, family and community engagement, dual language development, observation, screening, assessment and documentation, special needs and inclusion, learning environments and curriculum, health, safety, nutrition, and leadership in early childhood education. We're mostly going to be looking at the competencies for culture, diversity, and equity, with a little bit of dual language development and special needs and inclusion. And so those will be the focus for this particular class, but I encourage you to look at the entire tool. If you click on this link here, and I'll put the link into the module, this is the CompSat website, and you can learn about the CompSat. If you go down here, you'll see each of the different competencies. And if you go to culture, diversity, and equity, you'll see this invitation to culture, diversity, and equity, and start with yourself. Those will be the videos that I'll put into this week's module. So you'll see those as you get started. So what is reflection? When we're talking about the competencies, one of the things they ask you to do is to reflect. And there's a video from the competencies in there as well. Reflection means that you need to know who you are yourself. That's something that requires a lot of thought. You need to think about why you make the decisions the way you do, how you think, how did you learn to think. That requires a lot of actually asking yourself some tough questions. Reflection also requires that we take the child's perspective as teachers, that we think about how they're viewing the environment and how they're understanding what's being said to them. No two children are the same, and so taking a child's perspective is an individual, constant process as a teacher. We want to examine our environments constantly when we're reflecting, making sure that those environments reflect the cultures and the children who are in our care, and that they are appropriate for the children in our care. As teachers, we should seek multiple perspectives, and the same is true with diversity in teaching. You want to listen to each other as co-learners, and also listen to other experts and professionals in the field. Sometimes talk to other teachers who are working through challenges similar to your own. Pause for inspiration. This is one of the keys to reflection in the competencies. I think pausing is one of the most important things we can do in life, not just in teaching. When we pause and really think through why we're reacting the way we are, why we feel or think what we feel or think, we learn a lot about ourselves. When we pause to observe children, we learn a lot about who they are. And then the final key to reflective practice is to turn questions into actions. When we turn questions into actions, we actually investigate to figure out what we think we know. So, the goals of an anti-bias teacher is to increase your awareness and understanding of your own social identity in many facets: sex, gender, racial, ethnicity, economic class, family structure, sexual orientations, abilities, disabilities, and your own cultural context, both in childhood and current. So, we'll be going back and forth between what you're doing in a classroom and helping you become more aware of your own identities. You'll also examine what you've learned about differences, connection, and what you enjoy or fear across lines of human diversity. We started talking about that last week, and there'll be elements of that that are going to be embedded into every week. You'll identify how you've been disadvantaged or advantaged by the isms: racism, sexism, classism, ableism, heterosexism. There's more. And we'll look at what ism means later in this particular lecture. And we're going to talk about stereotypes and prejudices and how have you absorbed those about yourselves or about others. We're going to explore our ideas and feelings and experience of social justice activism. How do we feel about the actions we are taking or other people are taking? We'll open up dialogue with each other and families about all of the goals. And these are very, very similar to the goals for children. The goal is that as teachers, as adults, we're always open to learning and growing, just like we want children to be. We need to make some agreements to make that happen. In our discussions, and especially as we get deeper into these topics, the first agreement we should make is that we are the problem and we are the solution. Everything we've learned our whole life has contributed to us being part of the problem. The fact that you're here, engaged in these conversations, means you're part of the solution. Both can be true at the same time. We didn't choose this. Our ancestors for hundreds of years have chosen the society that we find ourselves currently in. So let the guilt go and get to work on what we can do to make changes. Guilt is not something that serves a strong purpose, especially if we hold on to it. Guilt can prevent us from taking action to make change, and then we become one of those ancestors who let society stay the same. We have to remember that ours is not the only reality. There are multiple narratives. I don't think there are any truths. I think when it comes to human beings, we each have different realities and different perspectives. We see the world differently, and we've had different experiences. And so there isn't one universal truth of any situation or any particular incident. We each have our own perspective. Education is about change. It's about transformation of yourself as well as transformation of the environment around us. And so that's what education does, is it opens up those doors. If there's any agreements that you think that we need to make as a class, I ask that you put them into the discussion groups. We'll have a discussion for that. Or you can also message me privately and talk about concerns you have. But these I thought we could add to the agreements that we talked about last week of respectful communication. So some definitions: isms. An ism is the institutional advantages and disadvantages people experience due to their membership or perceived membership in certain social identity groups. In order to be an ism, there have to be institutional practices that participate. So if we look at racism, the institutional practices of funding for education, of housing, of voting districts, open or closed voting poll places, all of those are institutional practices that keep racism in place. That's what brings it to the place of an ism. Racism is not just a negative feeling about another group. It has institutional strength behind it. Internalized privilege is the psychological consequences for people whose social identities, that's their membership in one or more privileged groups, bring them economic, social, and cultural advantages. If I go grocery shopping as a white woman and I wear a mask, people don't follow me around the store. They don't give me an odd look and wonder what I'm doing and are they safe. I'm an elderly, or not elderly, 54 years old almost, white woman. I'm fairly innocuous when I wear a mask. But for a black man to wear a mask provides a possible threat to his safety or life. Even when we're in a time where wearing a mask is protecting the safety of all of us because of coronavirus, that privilege is very important for me to understand. It's something that I am aware of. If I were unaware of it and I said, well, it just must be something odd about that other person, that's why they're looking at him that way, that might be an internalized privilege. In order to understand our privileges, we first have to acknowledge that we have them and then challenge them. When we're in environments where we're receiving that privilege and somebody else isn't, we should be naming it. We should be talking about it. This came up in a post in social media recently. Some friend of mine was in Starbucks, and there was a very angry person who was saying things inappropriately to somebody who worked at Starbucks. And it was that person's internalized privilege that was in action as they were yelling at the Starbucks barista. And my friend said, stop. This is the rule. This is where it says this. Please do not take this out on this barista. And stood up on behalf of the barista. So privilege is one of those things that is very important for us to understand, especially when we have it. Because if we use our privilege, it can contribute to the isms that are acting in society. Internalized oppression is the psychological consequences for people whose social identities, their membership in one or more privileged groups, who experience any of the many faces of institutionalized prejudice or discrimination. Sometimes when people experience oppression due to an ism, they internalize that and think it's actually something at core about themselves rather than something that's wrong with society. So just as somebody who has internalized privilege thinks they have that privilege for some magic reason because they're inherently wonderful, somebody with internalized oppression may think that they're being oppressed and that people don't like them because there's something inherently wrong with them. And so that's where the isms can have very deep psychological effects on people when they internalize those interpretations of society, those isms, and make them about themselves instead of understanding the institutional pieces that have created that privilege and that lack of privilege. I want you to take a moment and pause this video, and I want you to take out a piece of paper and for 10 minutes just write. How do you see yourself as a teacher in 10 years? What skills have you developed? What are you working on 10 years from now still? What are your competencies that you thought a teacher needed before they entered the field? How has that changed during the time in your classes prior to this class? And then who is one teacher you really admire that you've seen working with children on topics of diversity? What skills have you seen them use? How will you use them as a mentor to develop your own skills? So just take 10 minutes and write on a piece of paper. This is for yourself. I will ask you to share what you're willing to in discussions. When you're ready, come back to the video. Welcome back. So we're going to talk about identities. During the time period between the early years and middle years, our identities shift from outward physical aspects of ourselves to include how society views or values us. A bias is an attitude, belief, or feeling that results in or helps to justify unfair treatment of a person because of his or her identity. So we can have a bias that isn't an ism if there aren't institutional practices backing it up. So cognitive bias is an important thing to understand as we start looking at how children develop their identity, how we develop stereotypes and misinformation of other groups. A cognitive bias is basically a mental stumbling block, a kind of brain glitch that can cause flaws in our judgment. And it's the key reason that hard facts and evidence are sometimes not convincing enough to change our minds about certain deeply held positions and beliefs. This video will be in the modules. I want you to watch it and really think about what they have to say. There is one minor curse word in the video, so just a warning ahead of time. But he talks about what is fake news, what is cognitive bias, and how do we beat it? Why do we fall for fake news? Why do we believe the things that people post? And what is it in our brain that is convincing us to do that? And it has existed, cognitive bias, since long before Facebook. And so there's research that he'll talk about in this video. There's 5 common types of cognitive bias. One is anchoring bias. That means you're relying too heavily on the first piece of information you came across. Blind spot bias is recognizing bias in others, but failing to recognize it in yourself. You probably know a few people who've fallen into that trap. Confirmation bias is listening to and trusting only information that confirms your beliefs. He talks about this in the video as being afraid to not belong to our group anymore, our family. That if we don't agree with their beliefs, our community's beliefs, they may unfriend us, they may isolate us. And so confirmation bias keeps us belonging to that group that has the same beliefs. So he'll talk about that more in the video. Negativity bias is focusing on negative events at the expense of positive or neutral events. And then outcome bias is making a decision based on the outcome of a previous event without any regard to the other factors involved. So that means we're in a situation, we think every other time I've been in this situation, this has happened, therefore this is going to happen this time. I will start a discussion group this week. We talked a little bit about it during our office hours Zoom, which will happen again this week. I encourage you to join the Zoom office hours, even though they're not required. It's an excellent opportunity for us to talk live about the content of the course. These are a few books that I encourage you to think about reading. I want you to share books with me as well. When we read a book about somebody else's perspective, somebody else's life, what they've experienced, we get a chance to step in the shoes of a different life and understand what it was to develop that personality within those identity frameworks. Enrique's Journey is a book written by a reporter who actually took the journey from Honduras to the United States that a young boy Enrique took. She traveled on tops of the trains, through fields after interviewing this boy, and followed his entire journey. And it is a very honest telling of why and how this young boy and many, many others like him traveled to the United States and what it was he was looking for. And there's a lot of statistics and information about immigration in that book that I found very powerful. There's a lot of others as well, but that one is one I'd highly recommend. Another one is Educated by Tara Westover. This is a book about a young white woman in a very poor religious community in the United States and how she overcomes that fear of education that her parents have to actually get an education and move away from the way she was raised. And so socioeconomically, I think there's a lot of great information there about at least one experience of growing up in a low socioeconomic environment. Saints and Misfits is a story of a 13-year-old Muslim girl who has some experiences within her Muslim community and outside of her Muslim community, somewhat based on the choice to wear a hijab and follow traditional dress, and somewhat based on the push-pull of being Muslim in the United States. And it's a very interesting novel. A Long Way Home is the true story of a young boy who got lost in India, many miles away from his home. He fell asleep on a train and didn't know where he was. And so he ended up in an orphanage and was adopted by a family in Australia, and then made the journey back home to find his mother, his birth mother. And so that's a really powerful book about cultural differences. When They Call You a Terrorist by Patrice Concolors and Asha Bandeli is a book that is the story of Patrice Concolors' childhood and her life that led to her being part of starting the Black Lives Matter movement, and a very powerful memoir. When the Moon is Low is a book about immigration from Afghanistan. It's a novel, but based on a lot of true scenarios of people trying to escape death in Afghanistan through Greece and France and a lot of the European countries. This Will Be My Undoing is a beautiful memoir. I encourage you to read Morgan Jerkins talk about her life. The First Part Last is a very short novel about a 17-year-old, 19-year-old boy, Bobby, and his baby Feather, and raising her as a single dad. Buddha in the Attic is about women who came from Japan to be wives here in the United States. And it ends with the internment of Japanese Americans in camps here in the United States in World War II. Becoming Nicole is a book about a young woman who's transgender and her journey to find herself. So these are just a few in my library, and I'll share others as we go along. I find that reading the true stories of somebody's past or a novel that reflects truth is a great way to understand a different identity and a different perspective. So please share the ones you're reading as well. Identity is a set of characteristics that somebody recognizes as belonging uniquely to themselves and constituting their individual personality for life, changing and flowing as they develop. There's a lot of different models of identity. There's an iceberg model we've looked at. The top is what's visible: food, language, literature, dance. As the iceberg gets lower, we get down into the deeper parts of identity that don't always show right away. What are our expectations, our assumptions? The more we know somebody, the more of the iceberg that, or the personality, the culture that we get to see of who they are. So, what about your identity? I want you to think about this week. What is your ethnic cultural identity? What's your racial identity? What do you consider it to be? What do others consider it to be? Language, excuse me, gender, sexual preference, family structure, socioeconomic status, abilities, religion, values, expectations. How would you define your own identity? And really think about that before you go into this week's discussion. This is another perspective on identity and differences. This one looks at there's an individual uniqueness, which is our genetic endowment and our non-shared experiences, something that makes each and every one of us unique. The next level we have is a group level, similarities and differences we may share with somebody who shares our gender identity, people who share our socioeconomic status, our age, our geographic location, our ethnicity, the same disability or ability that we have, the same culture that we have, the same religious preference, marital status, sexual orientation, race. We share group identities with the people in those categories. As human beings, there's a universal level of identity. Our ability to use symbols, whatever symbols they are, and they do change based on language, but the ability to use symbols to communicate is part of our universal Homo sapien human experience. Our self-awareness is often equated with being human. Our biological and physical similarities: we all eat and we all poop. There's some certain things that are just true. And there's common life experiences like birth and death. And so each of those three layers are the different identity levels that you have, from the individual to the group to the universal. So this is another way of looking at those three layers. Individual is each person's unique and genetic makeup, personality, and personal experience. Individual differences set us apart from other human beings, and it's integral to our identity. Our group focuses on the basic similarities and differences among individuals. Society divides us up into groups based on various demographic characteristics. Therefore, it's a part of our identities is based on our membership to these different groups. And then universal, there are characteristics that we share, as we said: birth and death, language, food, water. Social identity can take lots of different categories. This is that middle layer. Our work background, our experience, our communication style, our economic status, those tend to relate to our age sometimes. And sometimes they're related to the birth that we have. Maybe we're born into a family that's deaf, and therefore our communication style is going to take on a different physical communication rather than verbal communication. As we get older, we may have a deeper work background, more experience, we may have better economic status, we may not. Family, work life, marital status, functional speciality, military experience, job level, native born or non native born, religious beliefs, all of these different groupings, we have an identity. We could possibly, each of us as an individual, fill out one or two words in each of these little boxes that defines us. So if I were going to fill the boxes in, I would say my age is 53. I am physically pretty able, but I have very bad eyesight and an autoimmune illness. If I went to the ethnicity category, I would say I am Irish and French and German and a couple of other things, but those are the big ones. I wish I were Scottish. I'm not. Gender, I identify as a woman. I was born and identified as a girl at birth. My race is white. My sexual orientation is heterosexual. I'm not a smoker, but I was when I was 19. My educational level is a master's degree and ongoing education as much as I can find it, everywhere I can get it. I love ongoing education. I'm a parent of 6 children. I live in San Jose, California. I am a flexible, optimistic thinker. I am a union member, actually, in all of my jobs right now. I'm a union member. My religious beliefs are that I'm deeply spiritual, but I don't belong to any particular religious group and refuse to belong to a particular religious group. I am native born to the United States in Texas, actually. I currently have the privilege of being able to work from home, so I have jobs at 4 different places. I've never had any military experience, although some of my family members have. My functional specialty is working with families in trauma. My marital status is that I'm currently married, and my family work life is currently very enmeshed with COVID-19. We're middle income, so I would say we're middle economic status. My communication style is educated and open and direct. And then my work background is complex. So that would be the way I would fill in all of those circles. And each of you would have a way of filling in those circles. But you can see how getting to know somebody isn't just about putting labels in those boxes. There's conversations to be had. None of that covers the complexity of any individual. So Soul Pancake, this is another video that I'll put into the module. And it's a wonderful video about these 2 children sitting back to back and talking to each other and then describing each other and what they think the other one is, and many different questions, and then turning around and actually seeing each other and being surprised. And it's an interesting video looking at the assumptions we make based on what we hear. On a piece of paper, I want you to write this sentence and pause the video. Based only on my appearance, people would never expect that I, and then fill in the blank. So hold on to it, and you won't turn it in at the end of the night, but you'll be able to talk about it in discussions. When you're ready, come back to the video. I want you to do another exercise. I want you to find a mirror. You can use your phone or a mirror in your house. Please try and find a place where you can be silent and alone for about 5 minutes. I want you to really look at yourself in a mirror. Pretend you're looking at a stranger. Pretend the person in the mirror is not you. and using only words, labels, describe who you see in the mirror. They can be labels that you have for yourself or labels that somebody who looks at you might have. And write all of those down on a piece of paper. Try and do this for at least 5 minutes so you get lots and lots of descriptions. And when you're done, please come back to the video. So please pause again, do this, and then come back. Welcome back. One of the activities I would have you do in class, if I had you in a classroom together, is to have somebody else silently write down what they see when they look at you and then compare the lists. What's interesting is that how somebody else describes you is rarely the same as how we describe ourselves. And so it's an interesting exercise to get some perspective. But I think that it's interesting to think about ourselves as strangers, how others might see us, because a lot of our identity search ends up, especially as children, focused on how others see us. So in the discussions this week, we're going to talk about this quote: if we want all children to thrive in a diverse, interconnected world, then all forms of bias and discrimination must end. I want you to talk about the quote in discussions and what it means to you, what you're doing now to recognize and change your own biases, and what are you doing in the lives of children to help them do this? And where are you looking to grow in this class? And I'm asking you to be vulnerable in discussion and really share some honest answers to these questions. Another in-class writing, I want you to really think about, and you can do this after the video if you want, what these experiences were like for you looking in the mirror, and think about who you really are and whether one-word labels would capture who you are, and describe what you know about yourself. Do this just as a free write in a journal. You may want to choose a book that you use for writing all throughout this class, a notebook or something, so that you can hold on to this, because this will be for your own reflective thought. But describe yourself. What do you know about yourself, the lower parts of your iceberg, if you will, that others wouldn't know about you unless you let them in and got to know you a bit. So let's talk about identity development for children. Identity formation is a critical aspect of our development, beginning in our earliest years and throughout our lives. It starts from the moment of birth. We're compelled to seek out social cues about ourselves as a basic drive for survival. Identity awareness is a developmental process. Children learn through direct interaction with peers and adults. They relate the information to what they already know. Children gather a lot of social information through careful observation. They observe everything. They test information through direct and indirect questions and statements. Identity formation begins in infancy as children are observing, categorizing, and noticing similarities and differences. We talked about this a little bit last week, and they categorize that familiar with unfamiliar. As they grow into 2-year-olds, they begin to recognize themselves as distinct individuals from others. They notice and classify others primarily based on physical characteristics. They describe what they see. They use social labels because that's what they've heard. They imitate adults and emulate their feelings about people and things in their environment. So if adults are showing prejudice or bias, children will show prejudice or bias based on what they've observed and experienced. Racial identity plays a crucial role in identity formation. By the age of 3 or 4, children can accurately apply rudimentary concepts of race and can apply socially conventional labels of black and white to dolls, pictures, and people. How prominently race figures in a child's perception of themselves and others depends in part on their majority-minority status in their community and the quality of contacts with other racial groups in their community. Children who are isolated will form different opinions than those who are not. And so the perception of themselves with others will depend on how much experience they have and what the quality of that experience is. Gender and sex identity plays a crucial role in identity formation. Children are assigned a sex at birth. It doesn't always match the gender identity they have for themselves. But by the age of 3 or 4, children can apply the socially conventional labels of girl and boy to dolls, pictures, and people. These are most often based on stereotypes. These are most often based on other people's labels as they've put them on the children, not necessarily how the children feel about themselves. And so we have to remember stereotypes is playing into a lot of the ability to label. If somebody has long hair, they must be a girl. That's a label they learned based on that stereotype. Are boys and girls different? This is a video I'll put into the module this week too, and we'll look at some of that later in the class as well. So 3 to 5-year-olds are actively constructing an understanding of physical characteristics. They notice and classify racial and cultural differences as their social experiences increase. They have limited cognitive abilities, and they frequently make errors in constructing or understanding difference. They still have very limited experiences. They absorb the prevailing societal attitudes observed in their immediate environment. That means the adults they have the most exposure to will have the greatest impact on what they believe and how they believe it. They're aware of both direct and indirect messages that they receive from significant adults about difference. They're observing everything all the time. During the time period between the early years and middle childhood, the identities of children often shift from physical aspects of themselves to include how society views or values them. This is connected to that video we watched last week. Children start to look to other people to form their identity. 5 to 8-year-olds are able to describe themselves in terms of their physical, gender, sex, cultural, and racial characteristics. They begin to develop a sense of group membership as they struggle to discriminate between real and pretend and known and unknown. They use stereotypes much more frequently during this age. Stereotypes tend to be the way they can group, and because they've heard them so much in society, they're experimenting with whether or not they believe them to be true. They're very susceptible to stereotypic images about themselves and others that they see in the overall culture. Name calling can become a personal expression of bullying, racism, or intolerance. So one of the examples I have of this is my own son, James, who loved the color pink. Now, he loved the color pink in part because his 3-year-old best friend, Madison, told him that his favorite color was pink. But he really did love the color pink, and as an adult has come back to that love of the color of pink. When he was 4, he and Madison tie-dyed socks, and he had a pair of socks that were bright pink after he was done tie-dyeing them. And he wore them every single day for years. I had to wash them at night so he could wear them the next day. And in kindergarten, he came home at one point and said, "Mommy, I can't wear my pink socks anymore." I said, "Why not? You love those socks." He said, "Because some of the boys didn't have mommies who explained to them that boys can like pink. So they think only girls can like pink. And I know boys can like pink, Mommy, but I can't wear the socks to school because they tease me." So this is one example, and there's many, many, many that are far more harmful. But it's one that my son had that highlights that time during 5 to 8 years where children are using these techniques on the playground, these bullying techniques, to encourage other children to conform to different stereotypes. 9 to 12-year-olds tend to deepen their understanding of the various factors that define racial and cultural identity. They begin to understand the concept of ancestry, that groups came before us, that created society and perpetuated aspects of society. They have feelings and knowledge about racism, bias, and prejudice that may be centered on their own cultural values. They have the capacity to become engaged in social action projects. This tends to be a great time of social action for many different children. You hear a lot of stories of children in this age group taking on projects to try and make change within society. Intersectionality is a term that's being talked about quite a bit right now. Intersectionality is the multiple layering of identities. All individuals belong to more than one group, but one of those identities may be more important to us than others at any given time. Characteristics of the person as well as the situation interact in many to determine which identity is the most important at any given time. So racial salience, the significance of one's race varies across individuals and across situations. For example, being the only African American in a certain situation may make race really important to one person, but have little or no effect to another one of the same race group, another African American in that same situation. So it'll depend on the person. Intersectionality of isms is a really important thing to pay attention to. Someone who has oppression based on a racial categorization and also has oppression based on socioeconomic status has multiple layers of disadvantage that they're battling. There are certain differences children notice. They notice gender differences, which is the perception of male and female. While we have moved in many ways as a society to start talking about gender as a more fluid categorization rather than a binary situation, there is a lot of work yet to be done, and children still see gender as very binary in many areas. And that's something that is a conversation we'll have as we get to gender. Children notice physical differences, color, feature, texture, style, ability. They notice cultural differences, language, accents, diet, celebrations, again, that top of the identity iceberg. They notice people with disabilities that are very visual, like wheelchairs, glasses, physical impairments. And they notice family lifestyle, structure, rules, discipline, who lives and takes care of the child. They notice body sizes, things like that. And so there's a lot of things that children notice, those differences on an ongoing basis, and they'll comment on them. And our job is to then have that conversation with them. Multiple layering of identities means that sometimes an individual will feel most strongly connected to one group, but also feel that they're more than simply that one group. So an example is a Latinx lesbian who most strongly associates with being lesbian, but feels she's more than simply lesbian. She may develop her identity within multiple groups who are non-dominant in society. And so people who have intersectionality have multiple layerings of their identities within key category groups that they feel strongly about may flow from one group to another, and the importance of one identity category over another will come up depending on what situation they're in. So let's define a stereotype. We talk about it. Everyone kind of knows what a stereotype is. We see them and name them often, but let's really get into the definitions a little bit. A stereotype is an oversimplified generalization about a particular group, which usually carries derogatory implications. So stereotyping is an oversimplified image or idea of a particular type of person or thing. Stereotypes exist everywhere. You can have a stereotype without having it be an ism. So a stereotype or a bias may exist about any group of people, but unless there's an institutional foundation to support that stereotype and that bias, it isn't an ism. Stereotyping exists everywhere. Our social labels are used by children to make sense of the differences that they notice. All dogs bark. They do the same thing with stereotypes. They try and group things together and put labels and stereotypes on it. Our job as teachers is to help them understand that that doesn't work as well with human beings. Stereotypes can influence our behavior without our awareness. For example, when we're jogging in the park, who do we jog closer to and who do we jog further away from? Stereotypes can lead to prejudice, which leads to discrimination, which can ultimately lead to oppression. So there's a cartoon here, and I don't know if you can see the text of it, but I want to talk about this in discussion, so I'll put it in so you can blow it up and look at it a little bit bigger so you can see some of the words. But what this is a white man carrying groceries, going one direction, saying good evening, and a darker skinned man going the other direction, carrying what looks like a FedEx package or a delivery package, saying good evening. And each of their thought bubbles, they're analyzing the risk factors and they're analyzing the mitigating factors. And it's really interesting to look at what each person is seeing as a risk factor and what each person is seeing as a mitigating factor. For each person in their thought bubbles, what they're seeing is stereotypes. And so I want you to take a look at that and talk about it in discussion, how people's risk factors change based on their experience and based on the stereotypes they're holding. A label is an assumption or a stereotype. A label is a name, a word, or a phrase used to classify or categorize a person or thing. Labels for people are often, but not always, inaccurate. An assumption is something that is accepted as true before one gathers any proof that it is. A stereotype is an often incorrect assumption made about all of the members of a particular group. So those are some important definitions. There's a lot of definitions in your book. I encourage you to go and look at those as much as you can during this class and tag them and become familiar with them. There are different ways in which children develop stereotypes. Their awareness first with observing, noticing, and understanding differences. They want to identify, they want to name, label, and classify people the way they do objects. Their attitude, they can be inclined towards thoughts and feelings towards something based on the inclination and attitude of the people around them. Children will start to show a preference, valuing and favoring something, usually that they're familiar with. So if we think about stereotypes in humans, the more exposure they have to one particular small slice of society, they'll show more of a preference for people who look like that small group. If children are exposed to a larger, diverse experience, they may have a broader preference group. Prejudice is a preconceived hostile attitude against a person or race, usually one that has developed because of the prejudice of the adults in the child's life. And the children then absorb that through their observations. Children learn through play. We're going to start talking about children's books this week. Pictures, books, and toys are all wonderful ways to introduce new concepts to children, especially a more difficult one like stereotypes. Finding fun and interactive ways to engage with children surrounding a topic such as stereotyping can increase both their knowledge and awareness of those around them. Both anti-bias education is so much more than that. So we will be looking at curriculum and environments, but there's a lot more to it. I do want you to do something this week before you engage in this discussion. I'll have one discussion set up for media review. I want you to watch 30 minutes of commercial shows for children and take notes. Pay attention to the characters, the people in the shows, and the commercials if you're seeing commercials. What races or ethnicities are represented? How are they represented? Who's the main character? What roles do each of them have? What are the genders of the characters in the shows and the commercials that you're watching? Are the roles different for people from different social groups? And what overt or obvious messages about different groups do you see? And what covert or subtle messages about people from different groups do you see? And then we'll compare our findings in discussions on children's media review. There is a link I'll put up to Saturday morning cartoons on my 13th birthday, August 18th, 1979. So you can watch that and then watch half an hour of cartoons now, again, watching the commercials as well, and take notes on both. What's changed and what hasn't? I think it's interesting to note the things that haven't changed in 30 years. And so we can look at that, 40 years. We can look at that and then also have a conversation about it as a group. We're going to start our children's books today. I want you, it says read at your small table. Sorry, that was for a ground class. I want you to pick your favorite children's book to share in discussions this week. And it can be any children's book, something from your childhood or something that you love reading as a teacher. And you're going to share the title of the book and why you think it's wonderful. You can share a link to the book on a website if you want to share it on YouTube or a posting on a Libris or a local bookshop so that we can get more information about the book. But definitely tell us about the book, and there'll be a discussion for sharing that this week. I look forward to seeing you online Oh, I forgot to get to this last slide. I apologize. Some implications for teachers as we're moving through anti-bias education. Value each child and how they're different from others. Don't ignore children's questions. Don't change the subject. Provide accurate information. Pick up on teachable moments. Correct misinformation. And take immediate steps to stop hurtful behavior. So as we move into next week's conversation, we're going to break these 7 steps down and look at what they look like in action and talk about them as we're moving forward into curriculum and conversations with children. So I look forward to seeing you online, and thank you for your time.